I can build that faster, cheaper, and better. Those are the famous last 3 words we tend to use anytime a spouse or a family member is shopping for furniture online, and we damn well know it's a lie.
The pen is blue. The pen is blue!
But we enjoy the process and the build and the challenge. And with today's day and age, it's not always cheaper to build something at home versus buying it online, and we know that. So today, I'm on a quest to build 2 cabinets for my living room per my wife's request. Now, I've been kicking this can down the road for the last 5 years, and I know if I don't jump on these 2 cabinets anytime soon, she's probably gonna kill me. So today, we're gonna make those 2 cabinets. They're gonna have white bases and black walnut tops. So let's go. So to start these 2 cabinets off, I chose to use 3/4 inch MDF for a couple reasons. First reason being that I had a handful of these sheets already on hand, so that helps cut down on cost. And the second reason is I know I'll be painting these white at the end, so I couldn't justify using something like a fancy maple plywood when I knew I was just gonna be painting them. So my sheet good breakdown process is pretty standard. I tend to start with my track saw to break the larger sheet goods down into more manageable pieces. Then I can then go to my table saw and make the finalized cuts to the proper dimensions. I find this to be the best method when you're working by yourself. Once I had them all cut out, there was a handful of pieces that needed some special cuts, whether it was my toe kicks or my dados. So I started by cutting the 4 toe kicks in each of the side pieces, or I should say the toe kicks in each of the 4 side pieces. And I like to do this on my bandsaw. I just find it to be very quick, easy, and repeatable. So once I had all 4 of those toe kicks cut out, I moved on to cutting the dados and all the appropriate pieces. So for the 2 end pieces on each cabinet, I just used my table saw with a dado stack, and that made very quick work of that. But I know not everyone has a table saw that will accept a dado stack or even own a dado stack. So my next method was using a router, which I did this because I needed to cut these dados in the lower base of these cabinets, and those pieces were 60 inches long, and they weren't real feasible to do on my table saw, at least safely. So I chose to use my router, and I made this very easy jig that gave very repeatable and accurate dados. With all the parts cut out, I can work on getting everything dry fit and all my holes pre-drilled. That'll ensure that I don't have any surprises during my glue up. Now, I would have preferred to assemble this on my assembly table, but due to its size and weight, I figured that would make things really awkward to get it back off. So I glued this up on the ground, that way I could walk around it and move it around to make things a lot easier on myself. For the face frames, I chose to use poplar for its low cost and its ability to accept paint very nicely. So I'll get a edge jointed and then all the pieces ripped down on my table saw to the proper dimensions. And then to assemble everything together, I just used some glue and some pocket screws. And I personally like to assemble the face frame material off the cabinet carcasses and then bring it over as a whole unit, and then just using some glue and some brad nails, I'll get it fastened to the cabinet, ensuring that everything's lining up and sitting flush. And if your measurements are right, this should come together perfectly. All right, the easy part's done. The 2 cabinet frames are built. So now it's time to make the doors. So each of these cabinets are gonna get 3 doors, 2 of which are solid and 1 is glass. So I think the easiest way to explain this is to start with the glass doors, because the construction type is gonna be almost exactly the same between the 2, except for the glass door is gonna have a few more cuts and a few more parts. So I started by cutting 3-inch wide pieces out of that same 3/4 inch MDF to create the door stiles and rails. Now for the door rails, I cut 3 mortises in them to accommodate the 3 stiles. These glass doors have a center stile to act as a divider for the 2 glass panes. So I quickly laid out the 3 mortises and then cut them out with my router. Once the mortises were cut, I went over and set up 2 workstations, my table saw and my router table. I need to make an 1/8 inch cut down the length of the rail stiles, and this will accommodate the glass retaining strip that will securely hold the glass into these doors. Once I had that 1/8 inch groove cut in, I jumped over to my router table and using a rabbiting bit, I cut a rabbet in both the door stiles and the door rails. And this will act as a shelf to hold that glass in place. All right, so that was probably a lot and I hope it made sense. But after all that was done, I had to create matching tenons in the stiles to mate up with the mortises and the rails. And to do that, I just used the same rabbiting bit in my router table to create those tenons on the ends of the stiles. All right, so we got about 90% of the work complete on these glass doors. I just got to finish up by doing a couple finish cuts over my bandsaw and with my router to ensure that all the pieces fit together as intended. After I've got my dry fit complete, I can move on to the finish glue up, and then I can just move on to making the solid doors. Now, like I'd mentioned, these solid doors are going to be constructed in a very similar manner, the same mortise and tenon joints to put the frames together, but I do need to cut in a 1/4 inch groove around the inside perimeter of all the pieces to allow the 1/4 inch MDF panel to be slid in. Dry fit those and then get those in glue up as well. And then of course there was a ton of sanding on these to get them ready for paint. So Rob, don't your doors need hinges to open and close? That's a great question. So yeah, I went with a Bloom soft close concealed hinge, and I just used my buddy Craig's jig to drill all the holes to mount these hinges. So of course I got the doors mounted, everything operated very nicely. I don't have the hardware yet for the doors, my wife's still picking that out, so that'll come later on in the video. So now it's time to move on to making the top. I kind of split off into a handful of directions here, so it got kind of chaotic. But let's move over to getting all of this rough sawn black walnut milled up and dimensioned so I can start piecing together the tops for these two cabinets. So fortunately, I got a small private mill just north of my house by about 10 minutes, and I got this black walnut that's rough sawn about 1.5 years ago, and it's been sitting and stickered in my shop ever since, so it's nice and dry. So when I purchased this wood, I didn't really have a plan for it. I had to get some nice square tops out of this lumber, and you'll see that these boards were anything but straight. You can tell that the tree was nice and curved. So getting these dimensioned and sized up for tops was a bit of a trick to kind of maximize the length of these boards. So I went through the process on that, getting these squared up and ready for some tops. All right, so I got all this walnut roughly dimensioned into more uniform board widths for the two tabletops. So the next step is going to be to joint and plane these. Now, I want to keep these boards as wide as possible through this milling operation and for the tabletop glue up steps as well. Now, the problem that I have is some of these boards are wider than 8 inches and my joiner is only 8 inches wide. So this is going to require me to perform an operation that I've done in the past that I actually like doing, but I know it's gonna cause some uproar in the comment sections because it is a potential safety hazard. Now to do this, I need to remove the guard and the rabbiting wing off my joiner. Now this completely exposes the blade on my joiner, which is obviously not very safe. What this will allow me to do is get a full 8-inch jointed face on these boards that need that. And then I can take that jointed face and put that onto a sled made out of melamine. Then I can run those boards through my planer, planing the top side or opposite side that I just jointed. Once I've got one flat surface, I can flip that over and then plane off that rabbet that was created on my joiner, allowing me to theoretically mill these full width boards that are beyond the capability of my joiner. So I was able to get 6 decent boards out of that stack of lumber. But going back to when I said I wanted to use as few of boards and as wide of boards to make up the 2 tops, I've narrowed it down to just the 4 widest boards that I got out of that stack. So I should have enough, but it's gonna be very close. So I'm gonna have to play around with grain orientation and be very methodical on how I place these boards or glue these boards up, because I'm not gonna have a lot of room for error when it comes to my overall width for these 2 tops. So I'm gonna spend a couple extra minutes making sure I've got things kind of figured out before I glue them up. Let me know down in the comments if glue ups stress you out, because for me, no matter how much of a plan I have coming into them, it's still a chaotic mess, and this was no different. I always get bad footage of this, so I apologize for that. But everything got glued up, turned out great. I'm gonna let it sit overnight, and tomorrow I'll come back and get it out of clamps, and then I'll true up the edges, nothing to final dimensions, but just square them up. And then I'll start prepping all of the cracks and knot holes for epoxy. So I'd like to consider myself a fairly cautious person, so I made sure to take my time sealing up all of these knot holes on both of these tops to ensure that I wasn't gonna have any epoxy leaking. Now there are very few worse feelings than coming in the next day after an epoxy pour to discover more of the epoxy on your floor than on your workpiece. So then it was just a matter of mixing up the proper ratio of this Total Boat thick set epoxy along with some black mica powder to give it more of a natural look. Being that these are a black walnut top, I find black, in my opinion, looks the best. It kind of just makes it look natural and just like a typical knot hole would be. So this took a couple days to do. Particular epoxy doesn't set up that quick. I think for the most part it took 48 hours, and some of these cracks and larger voids took 2 to 3 coats of epoxy to get them properly filled. All right, so here's my one shout out for the video. I came out, I got my hand planes all set up, got my orbital sander ready. I was gonna work on getting these two tops flattened and sanded, and after spending a couple hours on that, I thought to myself, there has got to be a faster way. So I reached out to my buddy Frank. You guys might know him as The Real Frank Does It over on Instagram. Well, it turns out he only lives a couple minutes away from me, and he's got a drum sander. So I reached out and said, hey man, I know you got a drum sander, can I please borrow it? He said, absolutely, bring those two tops over and we'll get you taken care of. So not only did he donate 3 or 4 hours of his time, he also hooked me up with this sweet shirt, and we got those two tops flattened and sanded in the matter of a couple hours. So go check him out on Instagram, he's got great videos, great guy. Thanks a lot, man, I owe you big time. All right, so I'm gonna switch directions and take advantage of the nice weather and work on getting these doors and cabinets primered and painted. So I started by getting some primer on the doors and quickly realized that I did not want white rock next to my driveway. So I rolled out some painter's plastic, and I was also dealing with a ton of wind, so I needed to make some sort of windshields to help prevent the overspray and just the general wind. So I used that same painter's plastic, and I happened to have some PVC pipe on hand, but I didn't have the right PVC fittings. So with the help of my 3D printer, I printed up a handful of these C-clips and these weird 90-degree fittings to assemble those windscreens. This helped block the wind and eliminate that overspray that I was getting. Did have some issues with bugs flying into my primer and into my top coat, so that made for some extra sanding in between all of those coats. So with that paint drying, I'm gonna move on to getting these tops completed and ready to be installed on the two cabinets. So I need to cut my chamfer in, get my threaded inserts installed, and of course apply the final finish. So I like just using a basic chamfer on these style of tops, but after I get the chamfer cut in, I always come back with a foam sanding block and just further soften those corners. I really like the way that looks. After that was complete, I flipped them over and pre-drilled holes for all my threaded inserts. Now, I was literally just thinking to myself that I had not made any sort of catastrophic mistake or I hadn't injured myself throughout the duration of this project. And it wasn't more than a couple minutes later that on the last hole for these threaded inserts, I punched a hole all the way through one of the tops. I was pissed. And out of laziness and frustration, I just grabbed a piece of scrap walnut and my plug cutter and simply cut a plug to cap that hole off. Yes, I'll be able to see that hole or that mistake throughout the duration of the life of these cabinets, but it's just a constant reminder that mistakes happen and you just gotta roll with it. I chose to use Rubio Monocoat 2C for the finish, but before I apply that, I'm gonna sand both these tops with 180 grit sandpaper to ensure I've got all the scratches and blemishes removed. To apply it, I'll just be spreading it across the entire surface. Then I'll come back with a white Scotch-Brite, buffing it into the surface, and then with some clean rags, I'll buff off any of the excess. Now, you can't remove too much, but you can leave too much on, which will leave you with a sticky or gummy surface, and you don't want that. With the tops finished and the cabinets dry, it's time to start assembling everything and wrap this project up. So earlier on, I mentioned this glass retaining strip to hold the glass panes into the 2 glass doors. So I originally saw this on my own kitchen cabinets and I loved it. So I found it online. Woodcraft was selling it, and then there were a couple other various websites. If I can find them, I'll leave them linked in the description below. But this stuff is actually awesome. It's super easy to install, and if the glass ever gets broken down the road, it'll allow me just to pull the strip back out, replace the glass, and then reinstall it. With the glass now installed and the hinges put on, I can reinstall the doors and work on getting the door handles installed. Installing the 2 tops on the cabinets was super easy. It was just a matter of lining up the threaded inserts with the slots on the carcasses. Then just using 1/4-20 bolts, I'll secure the top down to the cabinets. Now there's 3 rows of these bolts, so I'll tighten up the center ones and then just snug up the 2 outers, which will allow the top to expand and contract with seasonal changes and prevent any sort of buckling or cracking down the road. So now it's just a matter of rolling these out of my shop and getting them installed in our home. And hopefully she'll help me carry these up the front stairs and through the front door because these things are heavy. So like I'd mentioned, she'd been asking for these the last several years and they were much needed. We've got various electronics and books and blankets in our living room that need a permanent spot, and these will definitely help out with that. So I'll try and link any special hardware or materials that I used in my description down below. But now I need to get my shop back into order, get my next project planned out, and it's time for you guys to get out of my shop. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.